I think you are going to absolutely love what we're looking at today in the first chapter of Ezekiel, when Ezekiel gets his visions of God. Now remember, he is in exile. He is alone. His people have been defeated. They're in bondage. They have lost everything. He has lost everything, his identity, his future, all of his dreams, everything that he has prepared for. He sits there by the banks of the river Kivar alone. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had destroyed the temple, the dwelling place of God in the midst of his people. God is dead to Ezekiel. He no longer exists. He's not close. He's not near. He no longer extends his helping hand to him. He feels alone and lost. Have you ever felt like that? Forsaken, helpless, alone. God is dead. He doesn't hear me. Ezekiel feels like that, but when he least expects, God shows up. The heavens are opened and he sees visions of God. Okay, so let's dive in. It's 593. Ezekiel, son of the priest, about to be a priest, sits alone by the banks of the river Kivar. And he writes these words in chapter 1, verse 4. As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. Ezekiel sees this windstorm from the north. It is a theophany, theo God, ophany, appearance, a God appearance. You don't actually see God, but you see the effects of God's presence. And the only way you can describe it is by way of analogy. Moses saw God in a theophany at the burning bush. He saw God in a theophany on Mount Sinai when he received the Ten Commandments. God shows up in his Shekinah glory, in all of the glory of the presence of God. And it's flashing and burning and bright. A friend of mine has a home near the ocean, and they've got a widow's watch at the top of the house. And I remember going up there one evening when there was a great storm out in the Atlantic Ocean. And I could see the lightning flashing and darting to and fro, lighting up the evening skies. Well, that's the kind of image that Ezekiel gets here of the brightness of God. And there's this gleaming metal. When I was in college, I worked in the steel mills in Pittsburgh. And one of the shifts that I had was at the blast furnace, where they would bring the molten red hot steel out of the blast furnace. And it was blinding. You had to wear shields over your eyes. It was so bright and so hot and so intense. And this is what is happening to Ezekiel. Okay, let's dive into this theophany, this God appearance, where God appears in the Shekinah glory of his presence. Ezekiel writes in chapter 1, verse 5, these words: From the midst of it came the likeness of four living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had four faces, and each of them had four wings, and their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on the four sides, they had human hands. And the four had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another, each one of them straight forward, without turning as they went. In Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 5 through 9, Ezekiel explains this image that he sees of this great fiery storm coming from the north. He says, in the midst of the storm, there was the likeness of four figures that appeared to him. Now, as we read this passage, we have to understand that Ezekiel is trying to describe something that's beyond human description. He can't describe it. So he's going to say it's like this. In the Hebrew, it's a demuth. It's by way of analogy and by way of symbol. It's something that I want you to understand, and this is the best way I can describe it for you. So he sees four living creatures, the appearance of four living creatures. He later calls them the cherubim. Now, what are the cherubim? Well, there are two kinds of angels in the Bible. There's the seraphim, and their role is to praise God and to worship God. And there are the cherubim. They are appointed by God to live out his rule and his way in his world. They attend to God's way that he wants to speak to you and to me. They are appointed at the fall. The cherubim guard the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Paradise. We can't get back in. When man fell, when Adam and Eve fell, they were cast out of the garden, and God sent his cherubim with the fiery swords to guard the garden until the coming of Christ, when we could receive him and enter back into the Garden of Eden. They guard the mercy seat. What is the mercy seat? Well, as you'll recall, there's the Ark of the Covenant with the Ten Commandments in it and the manna from the wilderness. It represents the presence of God in the midst of his people. And over the ark are the two cherubim with their wings touching. They guard the throne of God, the presence of God in the midst of his people. And so here we find in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, that perfect cube, 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet, in the center of that Holy of Holies is the Ark of the Covenant, guarded by the two cherubim. Ezekiel is fully aware of the symbolism of the cherubim as he receives this vision. And there are four of them, representing the four quarters of the world, everywhere, the universe. They appear in this human likeness. That is, there's intelligence to them. They are rational beings. And they have four wings, two wings to fly and two wings to touch each other. And when they touch each other, they make a great square facing outward. And he tells us this great square made of these cherubim, they do not turn. They function as a unit. They move straight forward and backward without turning, and they move in the direction of the human face. What does all of this mean to Ezekiel? God has come to him in exile. God is not dead. He is alive. He is active, and he speaks to him when he least expects it. So the heavens are opened, and Ezekiel sees these visions of God. So what exactly does he see in these four figures, and what do they mean for you and for me? Well, the first thing he tells us is about the faces, which represent the power of God. When I am weak, God strengthens me. He writes in verse 10, "For the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The four had the face of a lion on the right side, the four had the face of an ox on the left side, and the four had the face of an eagle. Such were the faces." What is he trying to say here? Well, he sees these four figures, and they have four faces. It's how God created ex nihilo, out of nothing, the kingdoms of our world. And the first kingdom he created was the kingdom of human beings, of you and me. It is the crowning point of all creation. We are created in the imago Dei, in the very image of God. And God has set us up as the kings of this earth. We have intelligence, we have knowledge, we have beauty, we can look forward into the future. We have gifts that the animal world does not have. Now, I know there are times when someone says, well, my monkey speaks to me, or my monkey can understand the language, or my dog can understand the language, but not really like human beings. We can read, we can write, we have an appreciation of wonder and beauty, we have an imagination. We are so distinct from the animal world. And God said in the creation mandates in Genesis, when he created us, he said, you have two tasks: be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. That is, maintain a family unit of a man and a woman coming together to be fruitful and multiply. And as you do that, I want you to rule and subdue the earth that I give you as your dwelling place. Now, the next face that he sees is the face of the lion, the king of the animal world. The lion, he's courageous, he's bold, he's strong. Do you remember the lion in the Wizard of Oz? I am the king of the forest. And he's looking for courage. The second kingdom, the animal world. The third kingdom is the bull, the beasts of burden. They're strong and they're tough. And the fourth kingdom, the fourth face that he sees, is the face of the eagle, the king of the air that soars over all creation. This represents the great power of God in the kingdom of humanity, in the kingdom of the lion, of all the animals, in the kingdom of the bull, the domestic servants, and in the kingdom of the air. He sees these four faces, and they dart to and fro. They run, and they ran, and they return, and they go out, and they come in like lightning, like flashing fire. Well, what does this mean? It means that they are everywhere, active and moving. The glory of God is in everything that we see and do. They represent the glory of God. It is everywhere. It's all around us. I remember Joe Green, the All-Pro that played in the Super Bowl. He's now in the Hall of Fame for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And they asked him one time, how do you make so many tackles? And he said, well, I just throw my arms around all 11 men, and I throw them out one at a time until I find the man with the ball. And the sports commentators used to say during a game, Mean Joe Green is everywhere. He's ubiquitous, and this is God. He's everywhere in the kingdoms of the earth. And in his presence of being everywhere, he is omnipotent, omni, all, potent, power, all powerful over man, over animals, over beasts, and over the air. And this all-powerful God has come to change Ezekiel from a priest into a prophet. Remember, we cannot come into contact with God without our lives being changed. God changes lives. He changed the life of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. He changed the life of Paul. He's going to change the life of Jeremiah and Daniel and Ezekiel in exile. God is an all-powerful God who changes our lives, who strengthens us when we are weak. So we have the faces of God, which represents the power of God. When I am weak, God is strong. He's come to me in exile. The second thing he sees are the wheels. This represents the presence of God. When I am alone, he is with me. Listen to what he writes in verse 15. Now, as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the four of them. And I saw a wheel within a wheel. In verse 17, he writes, when they went in any of four directions without turning as they went. And the rims were tall and awesome, and the rims of all four were full of the eyes all around. He sees a wheel, and this wheel comes to touch earth. It's beryl, it's a precious gem. It's blue like the sky, like the heavens. It represents heaven. Heaven has come to touch earth. Heaven touches earth. What does this remind us of? It reminds us of the incarnation where God sends his son Jesus to you and me. Heaven comes, all of heaven comes to touch earth in his son Jesus. And in these wheels, there are eyes all around, all seeing eyes. Nothing happens or is hidden from the sight of these wheels. These wheels represent the presence of God. When I am alone, he is with me. How do I know that? Because he sees me. There are so many eyes. There is nothing that he cannot see about me. He made me. He hand fashioned me. He knows everything about me. When I am alone, he is with me. Okay, in this vision of God, he sees the faces of God, representing the power of God. When I'm weak, he is strong. He sees the wheels, the presence of God. When I am alone, he is with me. He sees me. He knows everything about me. And finally, and I love this one, we see in this image that he tells us and describes the rainbow, the promise of God. When I fail, he forgives me in his grace and his mercy. In the vision, he sees something, he writes in verse 28, like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness all around. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking to me. Ezekiel sees a rainbow in the midst of the fiery storm. Do you remember the rainbow? In Genesis chapter 9, verse 13, we read that God tells us, I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth, whenever I bring clouds over the earth, and the rainbow appears in the clouds. The rainbow, what does that represent? It was considered to be in the ancient world a symbol of warfare. It represented the bow that would shoot the arrows. It is a weapon. But here God turns it into something far greater than that. He turns it into pure grace and benevolence towards you and me. This passage in Genesis comes after Noah has spent 375 days on a boat, that God came to judge the world through the great flood and through water. But when he's finally released, God shows him a rainbow. When the flood is over and the judgment is complete, he sees this beautiful thing in the heavens. This rainbow is the sign of God's promise of forgiveness. God says, I will never again judge the world the way I judged it at the time of Noah. I am going to establish a new covenant with you, a covenant of grace. And so when we see the rainbow, we're always reminded that God is a loving, benevolent God, filled with grace towards you and me. The rainbow is the promise of God. When I fail, he forgives me. And when Ezekiel sees that rainbow, he falls on his face before the majesty and the sovereignty of God. And he says there's the voice of one speaking, that not only is God active and alive and shows up, but he is going to reveal himself to Ezekiel verbally. He is going to give him a message. After 5 years of being alone in exile, hopeless with no way out in Babylon, God shows up. He is not dead. He has not forgotten. He is present right there in exile. And this presence turns Ezekiel from a priest into a great prophet. You see, when we get into the presence of God, God is a God who changes our lives. He strengthens us. He is present with us. He forgives us. I remember the story of a woman coming out of an ice cream shop with an ice cream cone in her hand, and she ran into old Blue Eyes, Paul Newman. Now, if you don't know him, he was a great actor at one time, and women were falling in love with him and overwhelmed with him in the roles that he would play in his movies, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And she runs into him as she's leaving. He's coming in the door. And she's stunned, she's overwhelmed, and they pass each other, they sort of bump into each other and pass each other, and she goes out to her car. He orders some ice cream, and on his way out, he runs into her again. And she looks at him, and he says, you're looking for your ice cream cone, aren't you? And she said, yeah, how did you know that? He said, it's in your purse. When she came into contact with Paul Newman, she lost all sense of who she was. She was so overwhelmed with his presence. And that's the way it is with you and me and with God. When we come into his presence, our lives get changed. He strengthens us. He is present with us. He sees everything about us. He forgives us. And here he comes to Ezekiel in exile. When Ezekiel thinks that God is dead, he does not care. He has no power. God shows up. Okay, for Ezekiel, what's the so what? What's the take home factor? What's the difference that it makes in his life and in your life and in my life? Well, the faces represent the power of God. When I am weak, he is strong. And I would ask you, where do you find yourself in a place of weakness this very moment? Back on your heels, life's got you on the run. In exile, in captivity, in bondage. To Ezekiel, God is saying, I do not want you to feel helpless. I want you to approach your life, your situation, this very moment with confidence. I am an all-powerful God. I will prevail. And he sees the wheels representing the presence of God. When I am alone, he is with me. He sees everything about me. He comes and he sees Ezekiel in exile. And when he sees, he knows what needs to happen to Ezekiel, to the nation of Israel, and to you and to me. And he sees the rainbow, the promise of God. When I fail, God forgives me. And so where is it this very moment that you and I need to seek forgiveness from God, come before his throne of grace and receive cleansing and washing, today and forever before him. Get freed. Get freed from that which is holding you back on the inside. Take a moment today to say, God, forgive me for this specific thing in my life. So Ezekiel says to us, the heavens were opened in exile, in my lostness, in my aloneness, and I saw visions of God.